Good morning, Bob. Lovely to speak to you again.
Yeah, nice to speak to you again, Chris. It's getting quite a regular occurrence, this.
Oh, it's good fun.
Yeah.
Look, I think it's particularly valid now because obviously with energy costs going up quite dramatically, food inflation going up quite obviously and causing real concerns. I think it's worth just probably highlighting as a starter that this isn't the first time this has happened. And actually, there are probably good things we can look back at and lessons we can learn from the past that are useful for the future. Is that fair?
Well, I think the current conditions probably remind ourselves that, business is always tricky. And one of the fundamentals of running a business and actually understanding your own business is actually understanding all your costs on a daily, weekly, monthly basis and understanding all your cash movements so that you're in a position to make adjustments to your pricing or your menu, for example, or your business model very quickly. It's no good waiting sort of 3 months for some figures to start adjusting things. You've got to be doing it very quickly, particularly when you're entering a period of higher inflation than maybe many of today's current management teams are used to.
What are your thoughts on this year? Because obviously it's going to be a tough year for the industry, isn't it?
Well, I think it'll affect different sectors of hospitality differently. I do think we're in, if you're in the hotel or tourism business, or you've got a restaurant in a tourism hotspot, I think domestically tourism will be quite strong this year in terms of guest numbers. But the difficulty will be, of course, in servicing those guests because of staff shortages. I think contract food service and those who supply business and industry, it's going to be a much more tricky business for hospitality. So there will be some ups and there'll be some downs, and I suspect some hotels in tourism hotspots will probably have a very strong year this year. The worry I have for them may be that whatever strength they have this year, next year and the year after, there may be a couple of what I term fairly lean years as customers feel they really do want to go overseas, not having been overseas for perhaps 3 or 4 years.
I mean, one of the things that I find isn't talked about enough is obviously the fact that international business, particularly city centres, equates to high percentage of the revenues income for hospitality, and it's going to be a long journey back for that, isn't it?
Well, I think that's particularly so in London, but not necessarily so out in the regions. I mean, if you go down in Devon and Cornwall, for example, overseas revenue is probably less than 2%. It's almost entirely a domestic market, whereas, of course, in London, particularly at what you might term the top end of the market, it's in the past has been entirely dominated by overseas business. And the early signs are that Americans are returning to London, which is good news. But I suspect, of course, because of what's happening in Europe, the European market may be tricky this year in terms of Europeans coming to London. Yeah, so there will be ups and downs. So all I'm saying is I think it depends what your particular customer base is, and I know particularly some hotels in London which have always specialised on the North American market are anticipating a strong market this year. So there as in always there will be winners and losers.
I suppose they're like all things. The first question is. High inflation, as challenged it is, can also create opportunity, can't it?
Well, that's right. I think that the thing about high inflation is recognizing how important it is about managing your costs and managing your margins so that if you do have to make adjustments to your selling prices, you do it quickly enough and you do it in a responsible way. And when we do have a period of high inflation, which I think we are entering into now compared to what we've grown accustomed to in the last 10, 15 years is that, yes, business is incurring high inflationary costs, but in the main, the customers understand that as well because they're suffering those same inflationary costs at home. So there is some understanding of the need to raise prices. And again, at different subsectors, it will affect different. It will affect the hotel businesses to a different extent than, shall we say, contract food service, where you essentially only have two big costs in contract food service. That is food and labor, and both of those, inflation rates are probably higher than there are for a blanket of other things in hotels.
That's fair. And obviously labour has been now a major discussion piece in the industry now for a number of months. I suppose the question on
that's right. It's not just the cost of labour, it's also the availability of labour. And I go back to the subsectors again. If you're looking at the restaurant sector, it really does bring into focus that running a restaurant is all about managing your margin. It is a tight margin business, and if you don't control your margins and have costs almost on a daily basis, you will suffer. I can remember from my very early days of training with the Forte Group and then Trust House Forte, when we had very high inflation. I'm talking about, inflation in double figures, in teens, 20s. We actually took stock and were able to tell what our margins were at every shift that we operated. So where we had fast food operations in Piccadilly Circus, every handover shift you took stock so you knew what profit you had made on the previous shift. And if prices had to be adjusted at the end of the week, they were adjusted at the end of the week. That's what I mean by managing a margin business, which is what restaurant business is all about. And we've maybe forgotten some of those skills in the last few years, the importance of managing your margin.
Well, look, it leads on to a really interesting conversation piece that I've been having, is that people still don't quite understand. I know you're saying the consumer understands, but actually often they still doubt the inflation piece. So often when they see prices going up, they believe people are profiteering, which actually isn't the case. So it's how we build that trust back into the system, though, isn't it?
Well, that, particularly in contract food service, where, let's not forget that, some of the profits that the operator makes, come from rising discounts on retained discounts, so that during a high inflationary period, discount income rises quite dramatically. And that is why it's so important to have an honest and open relationship with your client so that trust is maintained. And, no different to the hotel business or the restaurant business, all business is ultimately a partnership with your customers. And if you destroy the trust in that partnership between the business and the customer, you will ultimately fail. The idea that, you can somehow con a customer or defraud a customer or not worry about the customer's reaction to anything is a fallacy. You have to have complete trust both ways. And the measure of success of a great business is always about the percentage of return customers. It's return customers, loyal customers, regular customers who are the profitable parts of the business.
All fair. I mean, it leads on to the point, though. Do we need, as an industry, still to work harder in our messaging and our comms generally?
I think think that is always the case. But I mean, we are no different to any other industry in that, maintaining a good relationship with your customers, communicating with them, and communicating with the wider commercial base or customer base is absolutely critical, and that's no different to any other industry. So sometimes I think we're special and different in that regard. I would take the view that we're not. The basis of any great business and any great industry is about the relationship it has with its customer and customer base. You treat them seriously, you treat them with respect. Hopefully they trust you, and you build that mutuality of trust. That is why in a good business, customers keep coming back to you, because they do trust you.
Yeah, no, fair play. In looking at the sector, one of the big debates, obviously, is that we need to invest more in our talent, and obviously trying to fight for talent, but also in terms of learning and development again, because obviously that's halved over the last 20 years.
Yes, and I think to an extent we go in cycles here, and I think there was a great recognition, over the last few years about how important it was to improve chef skills, practical skills in the kitchen, and there have been any number of initiatives, and even fueled by all the cookery programs on television about craft skills and cookery skills. And then that was followed more recently in some great work by the Academy of Culinary Arts in promoting the importance of service skills, so that front of house is seen as just as important as, the people in the kitchen in providing a great food service operation. But I think to an extent, we've almost forgotten the importance of supervisory and management skills at the end of the day, because actually, if you're running a business, it's about the management skills that really determine the success of that business. And I think, if I look at the various subsectors, I think hotels have actually done a great job in the last 10, 15 years, particularly through the master inholders grouping, of really recognizing the importance of developing skills of young managers who are entering the hotel sector and bringing on their skills, and encouraging companies alongside the master inholders to invest in the skills of young people and develop those skills. I regret to say I haven't seen that same thrust in either the restaurant sector or the contract food service sector. I'd like to see much more focus from those two sectors, working with colleges, etc., to have a real focus on the particular management development of people and the skills required to run a restaurant business, or the particular skills required to run a contract food service business, which are different to running a hotel business. There are lots of similarities in, as it were, the three subsets of hospitality, but there are also some very big differences, and you need to focus on some of those differences so that we can actually really develop the management skills that we need. And I think the two sectors I mentioned, restaurants and contract food service, have been particularly lacking in the last 10 years of developing young middle-ranking managers.
Leads on to one of the questions that comes to discussion is that people become very reliant on business models, which is understandable, but too reliant on the business model, and they haven't adapted during the pandemic to how the market's changing.
Well, Chris, I can actually almost bring in an analogy to watching the England rugby team or sometimes the England football team. It's almost if they're overcoached and, they're given a plan in the dressing room of what to do, but then when they get on the pitch, circumstances change and they can't seem to adapt themselves to what I term the changing needs of the moment. And business is no different. You go through college, you go through all the training programs, you have your plans, you set your budget each year. And, it's like setting a budget each year. It is really important to set a really, zero-based, bottom-up budget every year for your business. But if circumstances change, you haven't got to be afraid to change your budget and make adjustments, if you understand, if circumstances change. I mean, for instance, often people make business plans or strategic plans or a business plan or a budget 18 months in advance of where you find yourself. And who can predict, what inflation will be in 18 months' time? Who would have predicted the Ukraine invasion? Who would have predicted the pandemic? I.e., business can change totally in that period of time, and you've got to have the skills to be able to adapt your business model to where you find yourself and not be set rigid by, we had a plan, that's the plan, and that's what we must do, and you stick rigidly with it. As I say, watch the England rugby team or football team sometime when they don't have a plan B or a plan C.
Yeah, no, I understand that. But actually, that is one of the lessons of this pandemic, isn't it? Because people aren't adapting to almost the 11th hour.
Well, that is right. You've got to almost go back to first principles and, where do you now find yourself? What are the costs inherent in your business? Where can I get my staff from? What are now customers wanting in terms of a food offer or a service offer? And adapt your business accordingly. I've been to 2 or 3 great restaurants recently where I live in the southeast, restaurants within hotels, where they've completely adapted their food offer to essentially 4 starters, 4 main courses, 4 sweets. That is it. Fairly simple menu, but the menus are changed weekly. They're based on as much local produce as they can rather than sort of imported fruits or imported exotic vegetables, etc. And they've proved extremely popular. And they're also asking the chefs to be, let's just say, a little bit more adventurous in using perhaps cheaper meats, etc., to use their skills to present good food. And it's a success. That is what I mean about adapting your business to where we find ourselves now, not where you'd like to be or whatever. You have to go back to first principles and adapt your business to where you find yourself with your food supply, with labor availability, with what the customers currently want, within the cost pressures that we can all operate.
Now, 2 years on from obviously the start of the pandemic, what's been your great lesson from this period of time?
I suppose the great lesson is how resilient hospitality actually is. I mean, let's remember back, over those 2 years, there were several periods where, hospitality had to close down in its entirety. I don't just mean cut back. I mean, shut up shop for a couple of months, 2 or 3 months at a time. And yet here we are, hospitality is still there. It's still a very large industry. It is still probably employing upwards of 2 million people, and it will go from strength to strength, I have no doubts. So it's what I term the resilience of the business is what I admire about it and why I think it is such a great industry in terms of, the knocks that it suffered, but it's still there and still doing well and still showing signs of real growth this year and next year and the year after. Isn't that a great industry to be involved with?
And obviously, the last few months, we've seen the return of what I call real politics, kind of each side bashing each other up. Overall, though, do you think the government's done a good job getting us through this period?
I think the government has probably done as much as it could have done, in that it's never going to satisfy anyone and everyone. And I think the furlough scheme, that really took guts and imagination to introduce it as quickly as it did. Obviously, now we're going to have all the fallout of fraud that was involved by people who took advantage of it and shouldn't have done. But broadly, it kept most businesses alive, and it kept most people with some money in their pocket during a very difficult period. It also made the reductions in VAT, which I think were helpful. And I think it also recognized how important hospitality is as a sector in the economy, which I think is probably a plus for us in some ways, because I think sometimes in the past they've said they recognize the importance of hospitality, but I don't really think they got it. Whereas I think the pandemic has shown that, hospitality is almost the oil in the wheels of local industry in many places. So I think that message has got home, and it's something to build on in the future. So, my view would be, government did an okay job, and probably about as much for our sector as we could expect, bearing in mind all the other sectors that were also calling for support, not least public sector like education and healthcare.
Obviously, no, this is going to be a difficult year for the industry, but are you hopeful and positive about the future?
Oh, of course I'm hopeful and positive, Chris. Why not? I mean, one is we're in an industry where there is always demand. If you provide great food and service, you will succeed in this business. It is just going to be, let's just say, you're going to have to work harder the next 2 or 3 years than perhaps you had to work in the early part of this century. I think perhaps from about 1995 right up until maybe 2008, 2010, the financial collapse, hospitality sector almost had it too good and almost made too much money too easily. And then from 2010 to 2019, when COVID struck, it gradually, it recovered from the financial shock, but it actually averaged growth of between 3 and 5% per annum year on year, even during that period, which is an incredible sense of achievement. So, let's not forget that period of success, and I think that is one of the issues facing today's management teams, is that they've almost had 25 years of continual growth in the sector. So having had the last 2 years of, no growth and very difficult circumstances is a shock to the system. But I have no doubts that from this year onwards, we will get back onto a growth scenario year on year, albeit it will be in a different format to what it was prior to 2019.
The market's going to change, though, isn't it? Because
that's right, and as I say, I think the hotel sector, and we're still seeing enormous investments in new hotel projects, which is a strong sign. I think restaurants will have seen a major shakeout in the last 2 years, and particularly brands and restaurant groups that were over-indebted and got themselves over-indebted in the past years. A lot of those will have been sorted out. And I think the contract food service market is perhaps going to be the most challenging of the sectors, because I think the core B&I market, I don't see that increasing in size in the foreseeable future. I see that gradually contracting. So those in contract food service are going to have to find, other areas where to exercise their skills to sort of grow their businesses. And of course, I think I see consolidation in that sector, which tends to happen when we see these conditions. The bigger companies mop up the smaller companies as a means of achieving their growth.
So who's impressed you? Can I ask which sectors have impressed you the most during the last 2 years?
Sorry?
Which sectors have impressed you the most? You seem to think hotels. Listen to you. It seems like hotels.
I think hotels to an extent, and I particularly like the way, in the very early days, when we had the real difficulties in the first 6 months or so, how quickly quite a lot of hotels, looked at what else they could do to bring in revenue, and also what they could do to help society as well, whether it was delivering food to disadvantaged people or delivering food to healthcare workers or whatever. I saw a lot of hotels, getting into delivered food operations. I think sometimes the hotels, they reacted quicker Yeah, I think restaurants were in a very difficult sector, but then I did begin to see some restaurants looking at alternative ways of earning some revenue. I think contract catering was probably the least innovative in some ways in terms of looking at how else can we, earn some revenue during this difficult time, or, can we explore other services, or what else can we be doing with the core skills that we have. So I think the hotel sector, did well in terms of, how can we get alternative sources of revenue to keep going, but also how can we help society as well, which is the important thing.
Yeah, I mean, that social piece has become a more core theme, hasn't it, for all companies?
I think it's getting people to recognise, how important hospitality is, but also that hospitality has a key role to play in modern societies and developing modern societies. And I think that's to the plus, as it were. It's not just about finding jobs for people and giving people fulfilled careers, but it's also about helping helping disadvantaged people in society with their food needs, with their social needs, etc., etc. And I think, I admire a lot of the hoteliers who I think, sort of really showed the way forward in the early days of the pandemic.
Yeah, no, fascinating to watch, isn't it? Fascinating to watch. Bob, can I say?
Well, it is, and as I say, when we're able to look back on this period, perhaps in 2 or 3 years' time, we'll be able to pick out, the lessons that have been learned from that difficult period, because there are always positive lessons that come out of these difficult periods. Good businesses ultimately flourish because they've taken the lessons, and sometimes you have a shakeout of poor businesses, and perhaps sometimes you need a shakeout of poor businesses, however harsh that sounds. And also, I think, the lesson of how important it is about hanging on to your key staff, and those businesses that treated their staff well during the 2 years of the pandemic, even when furlough schemes were in existence. I think some companies treated their staff far better, communicated with them, and kept in touch with them, so that when they needed them to return, they actually had some staff to return, whereas other companies, once furlough existed, lost touch with their staff, and then they were surprised why then those staff found other jobs in other areas, and now they're struggling about getting staff together again. So the lesson is, even in difficult times, look after your staff, they're your greater family, and treat them as such.
No, look, I completely agree. It's going to be fascinating, isn't it? I do worry the next year is going to be the toughest yet. But after that, we'll see a rebuilding process.
Well, that's right, Chris, but I think you mustn't be too pessimistic that even when you have difficult periods or a rebuilding process, sometimes, it's like pruning your rose bush or your apple trees. Sometimes you have to give quite a hard prune of the bush to get the future growth and for it to flourish and be successful.
I think that's very fair.
I look upon the last 2 years as the hard prune.
Yeah, well, I think the hard prune's coming this year, actually. I think it's a viable now prune. So let's see where we go. Bob, can I say thank you very much indeed for your time today?
It's always a pleasure, Chris, and I look forward to our next